Hello again, it's Rob, and today we're going to have a look at business processes, talk about what they are and why they're important for our course or why we're interested in them. We'll also look at information and try to define it a little more clearly, especially what good information is and how it's used in business processes. And then we'll also take a look at a field of study called BPM, or Business Process Management, what that's all about, and that'll lead us into learning how we can document and describe business processes a little bit better. So let's get started. So a business process is a series of tasks or steps that we do to produce something, often a service, sometimes a product, in the type of work that we do. I've got a process for creating videos, for example. We've got processes for reordering office supplies. There's processes that you follow for signing up for a course at the college. And you can think of endless examples of what a business process might be. Trouble is, we don't often always think about them in depth, do we? We don't, think about what are the steps in this process. We just sort of work on it. Well, good businesses do think about those steps, because if you think about them and articulate them and document them, then you can start to think about improving them, and you can share how those processes work with other people. In fact, in the past, I did some consulting with small companies that were struggling, and that was one of the key areas we would look at. We would sit down with the owners and say, what's your process for doing, such and such? And we would start to work and kind of tease that out and articulate that well. If we're successful at doing that, then we could document that and teach that to the employees. And then that took a little bit of pressure off the owner, and they knew that the employees could then be counted on to do things the right way. Well, that's an important part of growing your business, isn't it? And so any, bigger organization is going to have processes documented that we can work with. Really, one way to think of an organization is they're just a collection of many processes, and the key thing is those processes have to work together as well. And so systems can be a big part of that. Here's an example from our text. They talk about Tim Hortons and just part of the inventory management process. And they start it with someone coming in, a customer, and ordering something. So there's a customer over here, and they order something. Well, the counter sale person here is going to tell them how much they owe. And so there's a payment going back and forth there. And eventually the items will come back and forth as well. But before that happens, a whole pile of things sort of happen on the back side here, over on this piece. We've got the inventory being updated. We've got the sales database being updated and the inventory database being updated as well. That may trigger other things, like purchasing over here may then decide to go issue a purchase order for the supplier to send in some new goods, which come back into receiving, which then go back into the inventory. They're also going to trigger something from accounts payable. They're going to say, look, we sent you some goods. Can you send back the payment? Well, before they do that, they're probably going to check to see that the order was received and that it was okay. So there's all kinds of things happening here in the background, and that's what this picture is trying to describe for us. Now, in our book, they describe a business process as consisting of activities, resources, facilities, and of course information to help keep it all together. And so if we go back to that diagram, we can have a look and say, okay, activities, they transform information from one type to another. They follow rules and procedures, right? Maybe they're manual, maybe they're automated, maybe a combination of both. So the payment activity, well, we saw that that triggered all sorts of things. One example would be the inventory information, the inventory database. That's going to be updated now, isn't it? Right? And so that might be one activity, is we're going to update the amount of inventory in the database. Another one was to update the sales database. Right? we also triggered some things going on in purchasing. So there's lots of activity happening in there in this particular diagram. We also had resources, right? Those are just items of value. So that's a little more clear maybe. Workers, suppliers, customers, they're all valuable to the business. We call those resources. And facilities, similar to resources maybe, but they're the structures used within a process. So buildings, equipment, databases, that sort of thing. Even things like inventory, we might consider to be a resource as well, right? So those are resources. And then finally, they talked about information. Well, that's really what's flowing around here, isn't it? And helping us transform activities from, or helping the activities know what to do. Now, information is sort of all over the place here. Really, activities use information to figure out how to transform inputs into outputs. So we had an order coming in that was some information, and eventually that got transformed into some products and maybe even some change being given back to the customer, right? So the information was used to help take what came in into what went out. And there's lots of information flowing around helping to figure out things, even all the way back to purchase orders, sort of on the back end as well. So processes create information too, right? So information comes out of the act of a process happening. Now, the picture we had was sort of okay, the one that they give us in the book, but really it's not the most clear picture, is it? It's a little hard to understand. We can kind of get into it in depth maybe and explain it, but there's got to be a better way and a more standardized way to draw these, and there is, and it's called business process modeling. Right? And so there's a notation for that. That's sort of a standard that we use to document business processes. And they do talk about that at the end of the chapter, and they give kind of a starter guide on it. I'm going to give you an even simpler version that we can use to get started so we can help to understand these things. And that's what we're going to learn. Before I get there, though, I want to talk a little bit more about information. Right? What is information? We start to use the word a lot, but do we really know what it means? Well, there's lots of definitions out there. Information, sometimes described as knowledge that we derive from data. So we have data, which is just all kinds of facts and bits of data floating around. And if we transform those somehow, turn them into something meaningful, maybe that's knowledge. And that could be called information. So, for example, imagine all of the data that gets generated by a cash register at the grocery store during the day. Well, what if we sort that and sum it up by product, right? Or perhaps by payment type, or by customer, right? That kind of thing. Then it becomes more interesting, and that could be considered information. The second definition is similar. It says data presented in a meaningful context. So if I'm studying customer behavior, and I take that point of sale data from the cash register, and I organize and sort and maybe do some other statistical analysis on it to help present it so it tells me more about customers, then it becomes meaningful. I guess in the simplest sense, then we could say process data. That's the third definition there. So there's some similar ideas going on here, isn't there? So we're summing, ordering, averaging, grouping, comparing, other similar things. If you've taken Biz 230, the statistics course, you learn lots of other things we can do statistically to data to help describe it. In fact, that was the first part of the Biz 230 course, wasn't it? It was called descriptive statistics, where we can describe things. So that may be useful to do something like that to it. And if you took Biz 145, you probably did some operations like that in both Excel and Access, where you may have, summed or ordered or averaged or grouped or something the data that you're keeping track of. This last one here in the list, a difference that makes a difference. That's interesting too, isn't it? Kind of an odd way to say it, but I think it's looking at differences in data to help us understand it better, right? So did the data change, right? And is that meaningful or useful to us? So that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. I really like the final one here on the slide. That kind of puts it all together. And its information is derived from data, and it's meaningful within a context. So we have our base data, We do something to it, turn it into information, but it's got to be meaningful within a context, right? So some information that may be helpful to me when I get the student information from CamLink is how many students have taken the course previously and were not successful. That might be interesting to me because maybe I can, know something about those students and I can try to help them a little bit. Maybe when I do the midterm and I get the scores back, I can look and I can see so from that data, turn that into information and say, boy, nobody did well on a particular topic. Maybe that's more my problem than theirs. Maybe I should consider a way to explain that topic a little better. So that's helping me within the context of trying to help students and the context of my job as an instructor. Well, so that's good, right? Now, if I had information derived from data, like how many of my students were born in September, well, that is information derived from data, but it's not really meaningful in the context of trying to teach. So that one might not be quite, within our definition. And that sort of makes sense. So I think that the one in red here is a pretty good one that we can use going forward. Information is derived from data, and it's meaningful within a context. So we've done something to it to make it useful to us or valuable to us. That's another good thing we always want to keep in mind as we go through this course is why are we doing something if it's not valuable? There should be some value in a business sense for us. Here's some good characteristics of good information. It should be accurate. So we don't want any mistakes in our data. It should be correct and complete. Should be this kind of stuff we need to do our jobs. So it should be important for management. We can do cross-checking to ensure accuracy, that sort of thing. For example, it would be not a very good situation if all the contact information we had for students was not accurate. How could we ever get a hold of you? So we do want to check that to make sure that that's okay. Now, timely should be produced, when we need it, right? So it doesn't really help me a whole lot to learn in my company that something's going wrong if it's too late to do anything about it. I should know as soon as possible so I've got a chance to make some changes perhaps, right? So we need it in time to do something with it, and it should be relevant to what we're talking about. All right, so we can think about that. Now if you did do database design in Biz 145, you probably spent some time in Access setting up various things in the data dictionary to make sure that your information was accurate. Like you might have put on an input mask to help people only enter data the right way. So the postal codes only went in a certain way, for example. Maybe you had some validation rules in there, like the dollar amount has to be positive, it can't be negative. Things like that. We can do other things like that to try to influence these things, can't we? To help make the data more accurate. Similarly, if we have good systems that people know how to use, that might impact, the timeliness of things. And of course, we always want to think about relevance as well. There's a couple others too to consider. The information should be what we call just barely sufficient. So that's one that people don't always think through, right? We just think, oh, we'll just have all the information. But if you've ever tried to go learn about something, one of the problems we face now is we almost are overwhelmed by information. We have too much available. How do we sort through it to get to the important stuff? So one rule we say is information should be sufficient for the purpose that we need it for, but no more. We don't need extra information that's not needed. All right. Now it can be a little bit hard at times to know what information is important and what's not, but that's part of managing information sort of in a modern business today. All right. So there's all kinds of things I don't need to know about students in order to do my job. Eye color, hair color, height, all those sorts of things. They're not necessary. So why would I capture them and waste time and energy storing that information and updating it over time if I don't need it? It's just going to clutter things up for me. Finally, it should also be worth its cost. All right. So, like I said earlier, we do have this whole value idea to keep in mind, right? So we want to make sure that the information we're generating doesn't cost more than it's worth, right? Because it costs money to store information and collect it and process it. And if we're not getting anything back for that, there's no bang for our buck. It's not worth it. So information must be worth the cost if we're going to maintain business value. So in a business process, whenever we do something, we create information, don't we? If I go to Tim Hortons and place an order, think of all the information I've created. I've created sales information. I've created information that can update the inventory and the purchase ordering side of things. I've got payment information on the go, all sorts of things, right? Business processes also generate their own information because they're transforming things, inputs into outputs, aren't they? And so maybe as part of that Tim Hortons process we looked at, we realize that Rob has just ordered the last maple glazed donut, and so that triggers, or well, maybe it was the third to last one. That triggers one of the employees in the back to go and bake some more, right? And so that process has sort of a spin-off thing where it's generating some information saying, oh, inventory is now low, time to create some more. So that's also important, right? So we've got lots of information helping the process move along and also being generated by the process as we go. Now, I'd mentioned BPM, or Business Process Management, and as a field of study, and as part of that, there is a modeling notation that they use to help us document these processes more clearly than what we had in the Tim Hortons example. It's not a bad little picture, but it's kind of a sketch, isn't it? And maybe not quite as good as we'd like or as easy to read as we would like. So let's look at, maybe a better way of doing things, right? So BPM is a whole management field that talks about let's develop really efficient processes that are effective and get things done for us. By the way, there is a difference between the words effective and efficient, isn't there? Right? So effective means doing the right things, right? And efficient means doing things right. So we can be efficient by getting things done quickly and seamlessly with low resources, but we also want to be effective, making sure we're doing the right things as well. All right. So how do information systems support business processes? Well, activities in a business may be manual, but more often than not, they're automated now, aren't they? Right? So you think about the weekly quizzes that we do. Well, those are just multiple choice quizzes in D2L, and D2L marks those for me automatically. I don't have to go mark those by hand. So there's a process that maybe 20 years ago an instructor would have marked every quiz by hand. Now they don't have to. It's automated, right? So we've changed that process a little bit by using information systems to help support it. All right. Now there's lots of variations on that, of course. The more complicated the process, the more interesting it might become, I guess. We've got activities that have their own system. They use several systems. Several activities may use one system, all sorts of things like that, right? And so when we're designing systems, we have to think about the relationship between activities and our information systems as well, right? That's part of the systems analysis phase. We're going to learn more about that later in the course. But for now, just realize that the systems designers have to have that sense of how business works. They have to understand business processes. And that may be something that we help them with. We may be part of the design team eventually, where we communicate with those people. Now, we're not programmers and that sort of thing, but we do have the ability to describe the business side clearly to them. And if we can articulate those processes, perhaps in a nice diagram that we can both understand, the techies and the business people, that would be a really nice thing, wouldn't it? So if I say that I want to automate a process, and let's go back to this 5-component model we learned about earlier in the course. We said we have hardware, software, data, procedures, and people. Well, one way to think of it is that we have actors. On the technology side, that's the hardware, but on the human side, that's the people. All right, those are the actors. We also have instructions. Well, that's the software code. That's the procedures or business processes that the people do. All right, and in between we have the data, sort of bridging everything. Well, automation really means let's take work, right, from the human side and move it to the computer side, doesn't it? Right, so that's what we're doing. We're moving things over. How do we know what people are doing? Well, we can look at the procedures, and that can help us write the computer software we need to automate things. So if I've got a business person that's come in and they've really clearly explained to me their business processes, that's going to be helpful. Because as a programmer, on the other side, a techie could take that and create some software. Let's look at a couple examples that they give us in our book. Let's think about counter sales. Well, that one's probably mostly automated in most businesses today. We've got hardware, cash register, point of sale system, right? So you've probably used some of those if you've had a job in retail. We've got our databases and other computers attached to that. Got some software, right? So sales recording programs, that's all part of the point of sale system, isn't it? To help with that, the person at the cash register maybe just uses a touch screen to say what's been ordered and everything is figured out automatically. There's some data there that comes out of that. On the procedure side, we do need a human to operate the cash register. Someone's got to push the buttons, don't they? And so that would be the cashier. But there's not much on this side, is there? And in fact, those are low-level skills, aren't they? Being able to operate a cash register these days. And that's why when you go into most retail places, who's at the cash register? Not somebody with a PhD, but just someone who's in high school, because they can handle that and do a good job at it. They don't need 20 years of training to be able to handle that. The more difficult stuff, a lot of the math and things like that, that happens over here on the hardware software side, doesn't it? And in fact, you talk to a lot of counter people, if the system went down, the cashier, may not even be able to figure out how to do the math to figure out tax and change and those sorts of things. In some businesses, they just don't have those skills, right? They depend on the computer to do it. So that would be a mostly automated system. If we go the other way, we might want to think about bill payment. Right? So think about a large organization. In the accounting department, there's probably someone designated as a bill payment person or an accounts payable person. And that job, well, they do a lot of interesting things like reconciling the invoices that come in with the purchase orders, issuing authorization for those payments. They also have to process exemptions, right, or exceptions to the rule. So sometimes things will come in that don't fit the pattern. You need someone who's got some experience and some skills and some smarts to be able to figure that out. In fact, several years ago, before I began teaching, one of the departments in an organization I worked for that I was in charge of was the accounting department. And we had a person in there, an accounts payable clerk, who was just amazing. This particular person knew everything, knew all the suppliers, knew how everything should work, and was able to save us money by making sure we didn't accidentally overpay or that we didn't pay twice for something, that sort of thing, and that we didn't pay late and get charged, and, late fees and whatnot. She's a very valuable person. In fact, so valuable that at one point I decided it was worthwhile sending her back to school for some additional courses because it'd be even more valuable to us. So we not only paid for those courses, we paid her regular salary while she was in school because we wanted her back. It's a very valuable person, highly skilled person. Now, she did use computers. She used PC to do her work, and she had to send emails around and receive documents and that sort of thing. So there was some technology being used, but a lot of the value in this process of paying bills was generated on the human side. Now, can we move some of that over? Well, maybe. Back then, there isn't as much opportunity, but now that we have artificial intelligence and machine learning and things like that, maybe we could automate a little more of the accounts payable job, right? So that's interesting, and that's something you often hear about. Oh, computers are going to replace people in every job, but the ones that'll be hardest will be the ones that require judgment and dealing with exceptional situations and that sort of thing. All right. And then finally, they give us an example of something that's maybe got a bit of both, sort of a balance between computer and human work. That would be the purchasing side of things. So you can have some purchase orders being triggered automatically from the inventory system and the purchasing program. So on the technology side, some of it's being handled automatically. But again, you probably want to have a purchasing clerk involved somewhere, right? And some procedures to follow to make sure that things don't go wrong. And so there's sort of a balance between the two, which is kind of interesting way to look at it. So that's it for this little video. I'm going to stop here and let you read a little bit more in the book about business processes and information and business process management. And then come back. In our next video, I'm going to show you the simplified version of business process management modeling or diagramming that I'd like you to learn so that we can begin work on our exercise this week.